Welcome to the sealed room. Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. What city, what country, what time of day it is where you are. I love knowing that these forgotten voices are reaching people across the world, at kitchen tables in Manchester, on morning commutes in São Paulo, late at night in Lagos. If this story moves you, please consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it helps ensure these voices aren't silenced again. Today, we uncover the story of a man who turned grief into revolution, who forged bonds stronger than iron chains, and whose final act of defiance would echo across an entire island for generations to come. Now let us step into the humid air of early 1800s Cuba, where the Spanish sugar mills ground human lives into profit, and where one man named Zabbath would learn that sometimes the greatest victory requires the ultimate sacrifice. The cane fields of San Cristobal Plantation stretched endlessly under the Cuban sun, their green stalks swaying like a sea of sharp whispers. Zabbath worked methodically through the rows, his machete finding its rhythm, thwack, thwack, thwack. Each stroke precise, economical, betraying nothing of the storm building behind his dark eyes. 26 years old, with shoulders that had once pulled fishing nets from the waters of his homeland, he moved with a controlled grace that made other enslaved people pause in their work to watch. There was something different about Zabbath, something that whispered of rivers in Senegambia where he'd been born free, of morning markets where his mother had sold her famous thieboudienne, of a life stolen in one violent afternoon when slavers had found him alone by his fishing boat. That was 8 years ago now. 8 years since the ship. 8 years since his feet had first touched Cuban soil in shackles. The overseer Baptiste lounged in whatever shade he could find, his thick neck gleaming with sweat, that crooked smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a snake testing the air. In his right hand, always his right hand, he carried an iron hook, its tip worn smooth from use. The enslaved workers knew that hook intimately. They had seen it tear flesh, split lips, leave scars that would never fully heal. Baptiste's eyes swept over the workers with the lazy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Work faster, you animals," he called out, his Spanish accented with something uglier. "The master wants this field finished by nightfall." Zabbath's machete never paused. Thwack, thwack, thwack. But in his mind, he was somewhere else entirely. He was holding a small yellowed piece of paper, his mother's recipe card, the one thing he had managed to keep hidden through ship searches, auction blocks, and countless inspections. The ink had faded until the handwriting was barely legible, the paper stained with years of sweat and tears and the oil from his fingers as he traced the familiar words in the darkness of countless nights. Thieboudienne for the family feast. It began in Wolof, though the recipe itself mixed languages the way his mother had mixed spices. A little French from the colonial administrators, some Arabic from the Islamic scholars, mostly the beautiful flowing Wolof of his childhood. The measurements were given in handfuls and pinches, the way his mother had learned from her mother, the way knowledge was supposed to pass down through generations before men with ships and guns had decided otherwise. That recipe card was more than paper and ink. It was proof that he had once been someone else, someone whole. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the familiar symphony of the plantation, the thwack of machetes, the creak of cartwheels, the constant murmur of voices speaking in a dozen different languages and dialects, all unified by their shared bondage. There were Yoruba speakers and Kikongo speakers, people stolen from forests and coastlands, cities and villages. The Spanish colonial machine had gathered them like scattered seeds and planted them here in rows as neat and orderly as the sugar cane. Zabbath straightened for a moment, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, and caught sight of Baptiste watching him. That crooked smile widened slightly. The hook caught the light. "You there?" Baptiste called, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man who had never known powerlessness. Zabbath, come here. Every worker in earshot went silent. Even the insects seemed to pause their humming. Zabbath walked slowly toward the overseer, his face carefully blank. This was the dance they all knew. Show nothing, give nothing, survive the moment and plan for tomorrow. Baptiste shifted his weight, the hook moving in small circles through the air like a cat's tail before it pounces. You think you're clever, Baptiste said when Zabbath stood before him. Working just fast enough not to get the lash, just slow enough to show your contempt. You think I don't see it? I think nothing, senor. Zabbath replied in Spanish, his voice level. Only work. Baptiste laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Only work. Yes, that's all you're good for, isn't it? That and breeding more workers for the master. The hook traced a lazy pattern in the air between them. Tell me, Zabbath, do you dream of home? Do you dream of running? The question hung in the humid air like smoke. Around them, the other workers kept their eyes down, but Zabbath could feel their attention like a physical weight. This was dangerous territory. Baptiste was fishing for something, probing for weakness. I dream of nothing, senor, Zabbath said. I work, I eat, I sleep. Nothing. Baptiste stepped closer, close enough that Zabbath could smell the rum on his breath, the sour sweat of his unwashed clothes. But that's not true, is it? You all dream. You dream of killing me in my sleep. You dream of burning this place to the ground. You dream of going back to whatever God-forsaken jungle you crawled out of. The hook came up slowly, its tip stopping just inches from Zabbath's throat. The difference, Baptiste continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper, is that most of you are smart enough to keep those dreams where they belong, in your heads, where they can't hurt anyone. But some of you... The hook pressed forward until Zabbath felt the cold metal against his skin. Some of you think about making those dreams real. For one perfect crystalline moment, Zabbath imagined grabbing that hook, twisting it from Baptiste's grip, driving it deep into the overseer's throat. He imagined the look of surprise that would replace that crooked smile. He imagined the hot spray of blood, the weight of Baptiste's body hitting the ground, the sudden, absolute silence that would fall over the field. Instead, he said, "Only work, senor, only work." Baptiste held the hook against his throat for 3 more heartbeats, then pulled it away with a laugh. Good. Remember that. Remember that your life belongs to Don Carlos, and your death belongs to me. As Baptiste walked away, that crooked smile firmly back in place, Zabbath returned to his place in the cane rows. His hands were steady as he lifted the machete. His breathing was controlled. But deep in his chest, something had crystallized into a hard, bright point of rage. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky the color of blood oranges, the workers filed back toward the barracks that served as their quarters. The buildings were long, low structures with walls of rough-hewn timber and roofs that leaked when it rained. Inside, straw mattresses were laid out in rows so close together that a man couldn't stretch without touching his neighbors. Zabbath found his spot, 3rd row from the back, next to the window that sometimes caught a breeze, and settled onto the thin mattress. Around him, the familiar evening ritual played out. Women tended to small injuries with whatever herbs they could gather. Men shared what little food they'd managed to save from their meager rations. Children, those too young to work the fields, played quiet games in the narrow aisles between the sleeping areas. It was Esperanza who noticed the paper first. She was perhaps 60 years old, her hair gone completely white, her hands twisted with arthritis, but still capable of the most intricate needlework. She had been on San Cristobal longer than anyone could remember, had seen overseers come and go, had buried more friends than she cared to count. The younger workers called her abuela, grandmother, and sought her counsel on everything from healing remedies to matters of the heart. "What is that you're holding, mijo?" she asked quietly, settling onto her own mattress with a soft grunt. Zabbath glanced around, making sure no supervisors were within earshot. then carefully unfolded the small piece of paper. The yellow had deepened over the years until it was nearly brown, and the edges had grown soft and fuzzy with handling. "My mother's recipe," he said simply. "Fortier boudin, a fish dish from home." Esperanza leaned closer, squinting at the faded writing. "You can still read it?" "Most of it." Zabbath traced one line with his finger, careful not to let the oils from his skin add any more stains. "She used to make it for feast days, New Year, harvest celebrations, when my cousins came to visit from upriver." "Read it to me," Esperanza said. "In your language." Zabbath glanced around again, then began to speak softly in Wolof, translating as he went. 2 handfuls of rice, washed until the water runs clear. 1 large fish. She always preferred red snapper, but any firm fish will do. Tomatoes, onions, okra if you can find it. Palm oil, hot peppers to taste. Cook the rice with saffron if you have it. Turmeric if you don't. As he spoke, other workers began to drift closer, drawn by the unfamiliar sounds of his native language. There was something hypnotic about listening to Zabbath recite his mother's words, something that transported them all, for just a few minutes, away from the barracks and back to their own lost homes. "The secret," he continued, "is in the timing. You must let each ingredient have its moment in the pot before adding the next. Patience, my son. Good food cannot be rushed." When he finished, the small circle of listeners sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, a young woman named Carmen, stolen from a Yoruba village when she was barely 15, spoke up. "My grandmother had a recipe like that," she said softly, "for jollof rice. She said the same thing about patience." "Mine made cachupa on the Cape Verde Islands," added Tomas, a man whose scars told stories of previous failed escapes. "Fish stew with corn and beans. She said cooking was like music. You had to listen to know when each note was ready." One by one, they began sharing their own food memories. Mothers and grandmothers, feast days and family gatherings, the tastes and smells that had once defined home. Zabbath listened, his mother's recipe card still clutched in his hands, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Connection, community, the beginning of trust. It was then that Miguel appeared at the edge of their small circle. Miguel was Zabbath's closest friend on the plantation, a compact man with intelligent eyes and hands that were equally skilled at carpentry and picking locks. He'd been born in Cuba to enslaved parents, which gave him certain advantages. He spoke Spanish like a native, understood the colonial system from the inside, knew which guards could be bribed and which officials had gambling debts. But it also meant he'd never known freedom, had no memories of life before bondage to sustain him. "What are you all whispering about?" Miguel asked, settling cross-legged on the floor. "Recipes," Carmen said with a small smile. "Food from home." Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "My mother never taught me to cook. Said it wasn't men's work." He paused, looking directly at Zabbath. "But she taught me other things. How to read Spanish, how to forge a pass, how to slip locks without making noise." The circle fell silent again. But this time the silence had weight. Everyone understood what Miguel was really saying. He was offering his skills, declaring himself ready for something more than whispered memories and shared recipes. Zabbath folded his mother's recipe card carefully and slipped it back into its hiding place, sewn into the lining of his shirt, close to his heart. When he looked up, his eyes moved slowly around the circle, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "Some hungers," he said quietly, "cannot be fed with food." They talked deep into the night, long after the overseers had finished their rounds and the plantation had settled into uneasy sleep. They talked about guard rotations and weak points in the fence line, about which foremen drank too much and which dogs had been trained to track human scent. They talked about the mountains to the east, where cimarrones, runaway slaves, were rumored to have established hidden communities, and about the ports where sympathetic sailors might hide a stowaway for the right price. But mostly, they talked about Domingo. Domingo had been Zabbath's dearest friend, a man who'd shared his dreams of freedom and his plans for escape. 3 months ago, they had attempted to flee together during a particularly dark night, carrying nothing but stolen bread and desperate hope. They'd made it almost to the mountains before the dogs found them. Baptiste had dragged them back in chains. Don Carlos, the plantation owner, had decided to make an example of them. While Zabbath received 50 lashes, just enough to scar but not enough to interfere with his work, Domingo was sentenced to hang. Zabbath had been forced to watch. They all had. That was the point of public executions on the plantation, to plant seeds of terror so deep that they would choke out any thoughts of resistance. Domingo had died with dignity, his last words a prayer in Kikongo that only a few of the assembled crowd had understood. But Zabbath had understood. Domingo had prayed not for himself, but for the freedom of his friends. Now, lying in the darkness 3 months later, Zabbath's fingers found the recipe card through the fabric of his shirt. The paper was warm from his body heat, soft as silk from years of handling. He thought of his mother's patient hands teaching him to recognize the moment when onions went from raw to sweet, when rice had absorbed just enough liquid, when fish was cooked through but still tender. Patience, my son. Good food cannot be rushed. But as he drifted toward sleep, listening to the quiet breathing of his companions and the distant sound of guards walking their rounds, Zabbath found himself thinking that perhaps his mother's wisdom applied to more than cooking. Perhaps resistance, too, required patience. Perhaps revolution, like Thibaudien, had to be built ingredient by ingredient, each element added at precisely the right moment. Perhaps it was time to start cooking. The next morning brought rain, a soft, steady downpour that turned the dirt paths between buildings into streams of red mud and filled the air with the rich smell of wet earth. The fieldwork continued anyway. It always did. The Spanish sugar mills ground on regardless of weather, regardless of human comfort, regardless of anything except the demands of distant markets and the appetites of colonial shareholders. Zabbath worked through the rain, his clothes soaked within minutes, his machete slick in his hands. The cane stalks bowed under the weight of water, making each cut slightly more difficult, requiring more careful balance and stronger grip. Around him, his fellow workers moved like shadows through the gray curtain of rainfall, their conversations reduced to necessary gestures and single-word warnings. Baptiste, predictably, had found shelter under a crude lean-to near the edge of the field. He sat on a wooden crate, his iron hook lying across his knees, and watched the workers with the lazy attention of a cat observing mice. The rain drummed against the tin roof of his shelter, creating a steady percussion that seemed to match the rhythm of the machetes. It was during the midday rest, such as it was, 10 minutes in whatever shelter the workers could find, that Zabbath noticed the rider approaching from the direction of the main house. The man sat his horse like someone accustomed to authority, his posture straight despite the rain, his dark coat streaming with water but somehow still maintaining an air of elegance. Even from a distance, Zabbath could see that this was not one of the usual plantation visitors, not a neighboring landowner or a merchant come to discuss sugar prices. This man carried himself with the precise, measured bearing of someone who represented higher powers. Baptiste had noticed the rider too. Zabbath watched as the overseer scrambled out from under his lean-to, hastily pulling on his jacket and trying to arrange his features into something resembling professional competence. The iron hook disappeared into his belt, hidden but not forgotten. The rider drew up beside Baptiste's shelter and dismounted with fluid grace. He was perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. When he spoke, his Spanish was crisp, educated, with the accent of someone who'd been born in Spain proper rather than the colonies. "I am Magistrate Herrera," he announced, loud enough for his voice to carry across the field. "Dispatched from Havana on the authority of Captain General Somaruelos. I have come to investigate reports of unrest." The word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of tension through the assembled workers. Unrest. That could mean anything. A work slowdown, a broken tool, a song sung too loudly or in the wrong language. In the Spanish colonial system, the definition of unrest was deliberately vague, allowing authorities to respond to threats both real and imagined with equal severity. Baptiste straightened, his chest puffing out slightly. "Magistrate Herrera, welcome to San Cristobal. I assure you, we have had no problems here." These workers understand their place. Herrera's eyes swept across the field, taking in the soaked, exhausted figures of the enslaved people. His gaze lingered on Zabbath for a moment, just long enough for their eyes to meet across the rain-darkened space. In that brief contact, Zabbath felt something cold and analytical, a mind that measured people the way merchants measured sugar or tobacco. "Nevertheless," Herrera said, turning back to Baptiste, "recent events across the island require vigilance. There have been incidents, work stoppages in Santiago, a fire at a plantation near Trinidad that authorities believe was deliberately set, whispers of coordinated resistance." Baptiste's face went slightly pale. "Coordinated resistance?" "Here. Everywhere," Herrera replied calmly. "The contagion of freedom spreads like fever, Overseer Baptiste. It requires constant treatment to prevent outbreak." They spoke for several more minutes in voices too low for the workers to hear clearly, but Zabbath could read the tension in Baptiste's shoulders, the way the overseer's hand kept drifting toward the hidden hook at his belt. Whatever Magistrate Herrera was telling him, it was making Baptiste nervous. Finally, the magistrate remounted his horse. "I will be staying at the main house for several days," he announced to the field at large. "Observing, evaluating. Remember this. The Crown has eyes everywhere, and the Crown's justice is swift for those who forget their loyalty." As Herrera rode away toward the plantation house, Baptiste turned his attention back to the workers. But something had changed in his demeanor. The lazy confidence was gone, replaced by a twitchy alertness that made him even more dangerous than usual. "Back to work," he shouted, pulling the iron hook from his belt and brandishing it like a weapon. "And I want to hear nothing but the sound of cutting. No talking, no singing, no breathing louder than necessary." The workers dispersed back into the cane rows, but Zabbath could feel the shift in atmosphere like a change in weather. Magistrate Herrera's arrival had altered the entire plantation's equilibrium. New rules were in effect now, though no one was entirely sure what those rules might be. That evening, the barracks felt different too. Conversations were quieter, glances more cautious. The easy camaraderie of the previous night had been replaced by the careful distance that people maintained when they suspected they were being watched. But as the hours passed and the overseers completed their final rounds, the old patterns slowly reasserted themselves. Children curled up against their mothers for warmth. Men and women settled onto their thin mattresses with soft sighs of exhaustion. The daily cycle of survival continued, as it always did. Zabbath lay in his usual spot by the window, listening to the rain against the roof and the quiet breathing of his companions. His fingers traced the outline of his mother's recipe card through his shirt, drawing comfort from its familiar presence. It was then that he heard the soft whistle, 3 notes, rising and falling, barely distinguishable from the sounds of wind and rain. It was Miguel's signal, the one they'd established months ago for communication that needed to stay hidden from authority. Zabbath waited several minutes, making sure the overseers weren't conducting any surprise inspections, then slipped quietly from his mattress and made his way to the small supply room at the back of the barracks. Miguel was waiting there, along with Carmen, Tomas, and Esperanza. They had formed an unlikely alliance. The old woman with her decades of plantation wisdom, the young woman with her fierce intelligence, the scarred man with his multiple escape attempts, and the Cuban-born lockpick with his insider knowledge. "Herrera's presence changes everything," Miguel whispered without preamble. "I got close enough to hear some of his conversation with Baptiste. There have been uprisings on 3 other plantations in the past month. The colonial government is scared. Scared enough to do what? Carmen asked. Scared enough to start executing people on suspicion alone, Miguel replied grimly. Herrera has been given special authority to investigate and punish any signs of resistance. He doesn't need proof. He doesn't need trials. Just his word is enough. Tomas shifted in the darkness. Then we need to move faster. Whatever we're planning, it needs to happen before he decides we're threats. Are we threats? Esperanza asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, Zabbath spoke. Domingo was no threat to anyone, he said, his voice barely audible. He was gentle, kind. He helped younger workers learn the routines, shared his food with anyone who was hungry. The only threat he posed was the threat of hope, the possibility that there might be something better than this. He paused, feeling the weight of his friend's attention in the darkness. Baptiste killed him not for what he did, but for what he represented. And now this magistrate has come because they're afraid that hope might be spreading. Zabbath pulled out his mother's recipe card, unfolding it carefully in the dim light filtering through the supply room's small window. The familiar words were barely visible, but he didn't need to see them clearly. He had memorized every line, every ingredient, every instruction. My mother used to say that good food cannot be rushed, he continued. But she also taught me that when the moment comes, when all the ingredients are ready, when the fire is the right temperature, you must act decisively. If you hesitate, the moment passes and the food is ruined. He looked around the small circle of faces, seeing understanding dawn in their eyes. I believe our moment is coming, he said, and when it arrives, we must be ready to cook. Act 2. The Recipe for Resistance. The morning after Magistrate Herrera's arrival brought an unseasonable chill to San Cristobal plantation. Zabbath woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay still on his straw mattress listening to the sounds of the plantation stirring to life. Guard dogs barking at some disturbance near the main house, the creak of cartwheels as the early shift prepared for another day in the sugar mills. The soft murmur of voices as mothers roused their children for whatever work assignments awaited them. But beneath these familiar sounds, Zabbath detected something else, a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very air, like the feeling before a thunderstorm when the sky grows heavy and birds fall silent. He dressed carefully, his movements precise and deliberate. First, the rough cotton shirt, patched and mended countless times, but still serviceable. Then the trousers, held up with a rope belt that had once been part of a ship's rigging. Finally, he pressed his palm against the small lump near his heart where his mother's recipe card lay hidden, drawing strength from its familiar presence. Today would be different. He could feel it in his bones. The work assignments were posted outside the barracks, as they were every morning, written in Baptiste's crude handwriting on a piece of slate. Zabbath found his name assigned to the eastern fields, the furthest from the main house, where conversations could be held with less fear of oversight. It was either coincidence or providence. Perhaps both. Miguel caught his eye as they filed toward the tool shed to collect machetes and collecting baskets. A single nod passed between them, the kind of communication that develops between people who have learned to trust each other completely. Today, they would begin in earnest. The eastern field stretched out under a sky the color of pewter, the cane stalks swaying in a breeze that carried hints of rain. Zabbath worked steadily through the morning, but his attention was divided. Part of him focused on the familiar rhythm of cutting and gathering, while another part cataloged everything he saw and heard. There, Baptiste making his usual rounds, but staying closer to the main buildings than normal. There, 2 guards he didn't recognize, men with the bearing of professionals rather than the usual collection of drunks and sadists who typically found work on colonial plantations. There, Magistrate Herrera himself, mounted on his fine horse, riding a slow circuit around the property with the calculating attention of someone conducting an inventory. But, most importantly, there, his fellow workers, moving through their tasks with the same careful awareness that Zabbath felt building in his own chest. Eyes that lingered a moment too long on guard positions. Conversations that stopped just as authority figures came within earshot. The subtle signs that told him he was not alone in his thoughts of resistance. At the midday rest, Zabbath found himself working alongside Carmen in a section of field partially hidden by a small rise in the land. She was humming quietly to herself, a Yoruba lullaby that her grandmother had sung to her before the slavers came. But as she hummed, she spoke in barely audible Spanish. "Tomas thinks we should wait," she said without looking at him. "Says the magistrate's presence makes everything too dangerous." "And you?" Zabbath asked, his machete never pausing in its work. "I think danger is what we live with every day. The question is whether we want to die slowly or quickly." It was a harsh assessment, but accurate. Life on San Cristobal plantation was a process of gradual destruction. Bodies worn down by relentless labor, spirits crushed by systematic dehumanization, identities erased through the deliberate separation of families and communities. Death came in small pieces, day by day, until nothing remained but the shell of what had once been a complete person. "There's something else," Carmen continued. Esperanza heard the kitchen girls talking. Apparently, the magistrate asked specifically about anyone who might be considered a leader among the workers, anyone who others looked to for guidance. Zabbath felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Did they mention names?" "Yours was one of them." The machete in Zabbath's hands seemed to grow heavier. He thought of Domingo, hanging from the gallows with his dignity intact and his prayers still on his lips. He thought of the dozens of other resistance leaders he'd heard about over the years, men and women who had dared to hope for something better and had paid the ultimate price for their audacity. But he also thought of his mother's recipe card, pressed against his heart like a talisman, of the patient wisdom in her handwritten words about timing and temperature, about knowing when each ingredient was ready to be added to the pot. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time to start cooking before someone else decides the kitchen is too dangerous." That evening, as the sun set behind banks of storm clouds that promised rain before morning, Zabbath made his way to the small chapel that stood on the edge of the plantation grounds. It was a modest building, little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a simple wooden cross mounted above the door. The Spanish colonial authorities encouraged enslaved people to attend services here. Christianity was considered a civilizing influence, a way to make bondage seem ordained by divine will rather than human greed. But like many things in the world of slavery, the chapel served dual purposes. While Spanish priests preached submission and acceptance on Sundays, the building also provided a gathering place where other kinds of conversations could take place. The thick stone walls muffled sound, and the religious pretext gave meetings an air of legitimacy that might deflect casual suspicion. Zabbath was not the first to arrive. Esperanza sat in the back pew, her white head bowed as if in prayer, but her eyes alert to everything around her. Miguel knelt near the altar, ostensibly examining the carved wooden figure of Christ, but actually testing the security of the doors and windows. Carmen sat halfway up the aisle, her lips moving silently as though reciting scripture, though Zabbath suspected she was actually rehearsing the arguments she planned to make. One by one, others slipped into the chapel. Tomas, still bearing the scars from his multiple escape attempts. Rosa, a woman in her 30s whose children had been sold away to another plantation the previous year. Joaquin, barely 18 but already showing the stooped shoulders of someone who had spent too many years cutting cane. Isabel, whose husband had died in the sugar mill when a boiler exploded, and who had sworn on his grave that she would find a way to strike back. They were not a large group, perhaps a dozen people in total, but they represented something that the colonial authorities feared above all else: enslaved people who had stopped accepting their bondage as natural or inevitable. We cannot wait any longer, Zabbath said without preamble once everyone had settled into positions where they could speak quietly without being overheard. Magistrate Herrera's investigation will conclude eventually, and when it does, some of us will not survive his conclusions. But if we act now, while he's here watching everything, Tomas protested, we'll all be caught. Will we? Miguel asked. Or will we catch them off guard precisely because they expect us to be too frightened to move? Esperanza spoke up from the back of the chapel, her voice carrying the authority of her years. I have seen magistrates come and go, niños. They follow patterns, just like everyone else. Herrera will spend 3 days observing, 2 days interviewing key personnel, and 1 day writing his report. After that, he will return to Havana with his recommendations. How can you be so sure? Rosa asked. The old woman smiled grimly. Because I helped cook for the last 3 magistrates who visited this plantation. They all followed the same routine, down to requesting the same wine with dinner. Colonial administrators are creatures of habit. Zabbath felt something click into place in his mind, like a key turning in a well-oiled lock. Then we have a timeline. 6 days to prepare, plan, and position ourselves. On the 7th day, we act. Act how? Joaquin asked. He was young enough to still carry traces of the child he had been before slavery, and fear colored his voice. What exactly are we planning to do? It was the question they had all been avoiding, the one that would transform their whispered conversations from theoretical resistance into concrete rebellion. Zabbath reached into his shirt and carefully withdrew his mother's recipe card, unfolding it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred text. My mother taught me that every good meal starts with understanding what you're trying to create, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. Are we trying to escape, to destroy, to negotiate? Each goal requires different ingredients, different timing, different risks. He looked around the circle of faces, seeing his own determination reflected in their eyes. I propose that we are trying to create something new. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. We are going to plant seeds that will grow long after we're gone. Carmen leaned forward, her intelligent eyes bright with understanding. You're talking about inspiration, about creating a story that others will remember and repeat. Exactly. Zabbath carefully refolded the recipe card and returned it to its hiding place. Domingo's death was meant to discourage resistance. Instead, his dignity in the face of execution inspired it. We're going to take that inspiration and turn it into something systematic, something that spreads. Miguel nodded slowly. A coordinated action across multiple areas of the plantation. Not an escape attempt, but a demonstration. Something that shows them we're organized, unified, capable of planning and executing complex operations. And then what? Tomas asked. They hunt us down and hang us all, just like Domingo. Maybe, Zabbath acknowledged. Probably. But by then, the story will already be spreading. Other plantations will hear about what we did. Other groups will see that coordinated resistance is possible. The seeds will be planted. They talked deep into the night, their voices barely above whispers, their plans taking shape like the slow accumulation of ingredients in a complex recipe. Guard schedules were memorized. Weak points in the plantation's defenses were identified. Potential allies among the domestic workers were discussed. Most importantly, they began to define their goals with the precision that Zabbath's mother had demanded in her cooking. They were not simply lashing out in anger or desperation. They were creating a strategic demonstration that would accomplish 3 specific objectives. First, to show the colonial authorities that enslaved people could organize and act in coordination. Second, to prove to their fellow workers that resistance was possible. And third, to ensure that their story would survive, even if they did not. As the meeting broke up and the conspirators slipped away one by one, back to their quarters, Zabbath remained alone in the chapel for several minutes. The wooden Christ on the cross seemed to watch him with eyes that had seen too much suffering, understood too much about sacrifice. He thought of Domingo hanging from the gallows and wondered if his friend would approve of what they were planning. Domingo had always been the gentler of the two, more inclined to dreams of peaceful escape than organized rebellion. But he had also died with defiance on his lips, praying for the freedom of others, even as the rope tightened around his neck. Perhaps, Zabbath thought as he finally rose to leave, there are different ways to honor the dead. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. On the surface, life at San Cristobal continued its brutal routine. Dawn work assignments, the relentless cutting of cane, the evening collapse into exhausted sleep. But beneath this facade, something was building. Information flowed through the plantation's invisible networks like water finding its way through underground channels. Isabel, working in the laundry, reported that Magistrate Herrera kept detailed notes in a leather journal, which he left on his desk when he went to dinner. Joaquin, assigned to tend the horses, observed that the magistrate's routine was exactly as Esperanza had predicted. Methodical observation followed by careful documentation. Rosa, who sometimes helped serve meals at the main house, learned that Herrera would depart on Saturday morning, taking his report directly to the Captain General in Havana. Friday would be their day. More importantly, word was spreading beyond their original circle. Not the specific details, those remained closely guarded secrets, but something more fundamental. A sense of anticipation, of change brewing like a storm on the horizon. Workers who had never spoken to each other before began making eye contact across the fields. Conversations that had once focused solely on survival began to include whispered speculation about what might be possible if people worked together. Baptiste noticed the change first, of course. His instincts for detecting defiance had been honed by years of practice, and the shift in atmosphere on the plantation set his nerves on edge like fingernails on slate. "Something's wrong," he muttered to one of his subordinates as they watched the workers file back from the eastern fields on Wednesday evening. "They're too quiet, too organized." The subordinate, a weak-chinned man named Varela, who had found his calling in the petty exercise of power over the powerless, squinted at the returning workers. "They look the same to me, Baptiste. Tired, beaten down." "No." Baptiste's hand moved instinctively to the iron hook at his belt. "Look at their faces. Look at how they move. There's something different." He was right, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what he was seeing. The workers did look tired and beaten down. They had to, for their own survival. But there was something else now, a subtle tension in their movements that spoke of coiled energy rather than simple exhaustion. They walked like people who were waiting for something. That night, Baptiste made an unscheduled inspection of the barracks. He moved through the rows of sleeping workers with his hook held ready, looking for what? He wasn't entirely sure. Hidden weapons, perhaps. Secret messages. Some concrete evidence of the conspiracy he felt certain was brewing around him. He found nothing, of course. Zabbath and his co-conspirators were too careful for that, too aware that discovery would mean death for all of them. But as Baptiste completed his rounds and returned to his own quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that dozens of eyes had been watching him from behind apparently closed lids. Thursday brought rain again, a heavy downpour that turned the plantation's roads into rivers of mud and forced most outdoor work to halt. The workers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, officially idle but actually engaged in the most intensive planning session of their lives. Groups of 3 or 4 gathered in tool sheds, supply rooms, and covered walkways, ostensibly waiting out the storm, but actually finalizing the details of Friday's operation. Hand signals were rehearsed until they could be executed without conscious thought. Timing was refined to the minute. Contingency plans were developed for every scenario they could imagine. Zabbath found himself in the sugar mill's storage room with Miguel, Carmen, and 2 newer recruits, brothers named Felipe and Eduardo, who had been brought to San Cristobal only 6 months earlier, but had already proven their commitment to the cause. The guards changed shifts at dawn, noon, and sunset. Miguel reported quietly, using a piece of charcoal to sketch rough diagrams on the wooden wall. For 15 minutes during each change, there are gaps in coverage here, here, and here. He marked 3 points around the plantation's perimeter. "What about the dogs?" Carmen asked. "Fed and kenneled during the day shift," Eduardo replied. "They only patrol at night." Felipe shifted nervously. "And Baptiste, where will he be?" "Making his usual rounds," Zabbath said. "But we'll be ready for him." The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. At precisely noon on Friday, when the guards were changing shifts and Magistrate Herrera would be at lunch with Don Carlos, they would execute a series of coordinated actions designed to demonstrate their organizational capabilities while minimizing casualties on both sides. First, work would stop simultaneously in all fields. Not the gradual slowdown of a typical protest, but an immediate, total cessation of activity that would be impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Second, specific targets around the plantation would be sabotaged, not destroyed, but disabled in ways that would require days or weeks to repair. The sugar mill's main belt, the irrigation system that fed the eastern fields, the fence line that contained the plantation's livestock. Third, and most importantly, a message would be left where Magistrate Herrera would be certain to find it. A declaration of intent written in perfect Spanish and signed with names that would become legend. It was ambitious. It was dangerous. And if everything went according to plan, it would be over before the authorities could react effectively. "Remember," Zabbath said as the planning session concluded and the conspirators prepared to slip back to their regular duties, "we are not trying to destroy everything. We are trying to plant seeds. Seeds that will grow long after we're gone." He touched the recipe card through his shirt, drawing comfort from its familiar presence. His mother had been right about patience, about timing, about waiting for the perfect moment to add each ingredient to the pot. But she had also taught him that when that moment came, decisive action was everything. Tomorrow, they would find out if 8 years of bondage had taught him enough about cooking. That evening, as the rain finally stopped and the plantation settled into uneasy quiet, Zabbath lay awake on his straw mattress listening to the sounds of the night. Guard dogs padding through puddles, the distant murmur of voices from the overseer's quarters, the soft breathing of his fellow workers, many of whom would play crucial roles in tomorrow's operation without even knowing it. He thought of Domingo, and of all the others who had died dreaming of freedom. He thought of his mother, standing over her cooking fire in a village that existed now only in his memory, teaching her son that every good meal required courage as well as patience. Most of all, he thought about the morning to come, when the sun would rise on what might be the last day of his life, and when he would finally have the chance to honor both his mother's wisdom and his friend's sacrifice. The recipe was complete. Tomorrow, they would cook. Act 3. The Moment of Heat. Friday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that sometimes follows heavy rain in the Caribbean. Zabbath woke before the first bell, his body alert despite having slept little during the night. Around him, the barracks stirred to life with the same sounds as every other morning: soft murmurs, the rustle of straw mattresses, the quiet padding of bare feet on wooden floors. But today was different. Today, the familiar routine would be interrupted by something that had never happened before in the history of San Cristobal Plantation. He dressed with particular care, his movements deliberate and almost ceremonial. The patched cotton shirt, the rope belt trousers, and finally, pressed against his heart, his mother's recipe card, the small piece of yellowed paper that had sustained him through 8 years of bondage and would now bear witness to his final act of defiance. The morning work assignments were posted as usual, Baptiste's crude handwriting dividing the enslaved population into the day's various tasks. Zabbath found himself assigned to the western fields, exactly as Miguel had arranged through careful manipulation of the duty roster. Everything was proceeding according to plan. As the workers filed toward the tool shed to collect their implements, Zabbath caught sight of Magistrate Herrera standing on the veranda of the main house, already dressed despite the early hour. The magistrate held a cup of coffee in one hand and what appeared to be a letter in the other, and his attention seemed focused on the eastern horizon where storm clouds were building for another afternoon downpour. Good, Zabbath thought. Let him watch the weather. In 3 hours, he'll have far more pressing concerns. The western fields were situated on a slight rise that provided clear sight lines across most of the plantation. From his position in the cane rows, Zabbath could see the sugar mill with its massive grinding wheels, the irrigation channels that carried water from the river, the livestock pens where cattle and pigs lived better than most of the enslaved people, and the network of roads that connected San Cristobal to the outside world. He could also see his co-conspirators taking their assigned positions. Carmen in the eastern fields, her red head wrap visible even at this distance. Miguel near the sugar mill, ostensibly checking equipment but actually making final preparations for the sabotage operation. Esperanza in the domestic workers area, positioned to monitor the main house and provide warning if anything went wrong. The morning progressed with agonizing normalcy. Zabbath cut cane with his usual efficiency, collected it in the designated baskets, and moved methodically through his assigned section of field. But his awareness extended far beyond the immediate task, cataloging every detail of the plantation's routine with the intensity of someone whose life depended on perfect timing. There, Baptiste, making his first round of the day, the iron hook catching the morning sunlight as he gestured at a worker who wasn't moving fast enough for his taste. There, 2 guards changing positions near the main gate, their attention focused on the road rather than the fields. There, Magistrate Herrera mounting his horse for what had become his daily inspection tour, his leather satchel secured behind the saddle, and his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. At 11:30, Zabbath straightened from his work and looked directly across the fields toward Carmen's position. She was already watching for his signal, her intelligent eyes bright with anticipation and fear. He raised his right hand briefly to his forehead, as if wiping away sweat, then lowered it to his chest in a gesture that could have been stretching but was actually their prearranged code. 30 minutes. Carmen nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned and made her own series of subtle gestures toward other workers in her vicinity. The signal rippled outward like rings in a pond, carried by glances and movements so small that anyone watching casually would have seen nothing but people adjusting to the heat of the approaching noon hour. But Zabbath saw everything. He saw Tomas receive the signal and pass it along to the workers near the livestock pens. He saw Rosa acknowledge the message and begin moving toward her assigned position near the irrigation controls. Most importantly, he saw Miguel catch the signal and disappear into the sugar mill's machinery room, where the plantation's heart beat in grinding wheels and spinning belts. 25 minutes. Baptiste was making his way toward the western fields now, his heavy boots leaving deep prints in the mud as he climbed the rise where Zabbath worked. The overseer's face showed the strain of the past few days. The presence of Magistrate Herrera had put him on edge, made him jumpy and unpredictable in ways that were dangerous for everyone around him. "You," Baptiste called out when he was still 50 yards away, his voice carrying the automatic aggression he used whenever he felt uncertain. "Zabbath, come here." Every worker in the immediate area stopped what they were doing to watch. This was always the most dangerous moment in any interaction with Baptiste, the space between his initial command and whatever violence might follow. Zabbath set down his machete carefully, making sure the movement was slow and non-threatening, then walked toward the overseer with the measured pace of someone who had learned to survive by never appearing either defiant or afraid. 20 minutes. "Yes, senor," Zabbath said when he stood before Baptiste, his eyes focused on a point just past the overseer's left shoulder. Direct eye contact was considered disrespectful. Looking down was seen as suspicious. The neutral middle distance was the safest place to rest his gaze. Baptiste studied him with the calculating attention of a predator evaluating prey. The iron hook spun slowly in the overseer's thick fingers, catching and reflecting the sunlight in brief, blinding flashes. "Something's wrong," Baptiste said finally. "I can feel it. The workers are different. Too quiet. Too organized." "I know nothing about that, senor," Zabbath replied, his voice level and respectful. "Only work. Only work." Baptiste laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You keep saying that, don't you? Only work, senor. Nothing else, senor. But I've been watching you, Zabbath. Watching the way others look at you. The way conversations stop when I get too close." The hook stopped spinning. Baptiste stepped closer, close enough that Zabbath could smell the rum on his breath and see the broken blood vessels in his eyes. "You think you're clever," Baptiste continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "You think because you don't run your mouth like some of these animals, because you keep your eyes down and your hands busy, that I don't see what you really are." 15 minutes. "And what am I, senor?" Zabbath asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. It was a dangerous thing to say, too close to actual conversation rather than the ritualized submission that Baptiste expected. The overseer's eyes narrowed. "You're a leader, a planner, the kind of slave who causes problems not because he's stupid or angry, but because he's smart enough to be truly dangerous." Baptiste raised the iron hook until its tip was inches from Zabbath's throat, exactly as he had done several days earlier. But this time, something was different. This time, instead of the cold fear that had always accompanied such moments, Zabbath felt a strange sense of calm settling over him like a familiar blanket. 10 minutes. "Tell me what you're planning," Baptiste said softly. "Tell me now, and maybe I'll make sure you only get 50 lashes instead of the rope." Zabbath looked directly into Baptiste's eyes for the first time in 8 years. The neutral distance was no longer necessary. In 10 minutes, nothing would be the same, and the old rules of survival would no longer apply. "I'm planning to cook," he said quietly. Baptiste's confusion lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then his face twisted with rage, and the hook swept forward toward Zabbath's throat. But Zabbath was no longer there. 8 years of slavery had taught him to read violence before it erupted, to see the subtle shifts in posture and expression that preceded brutality. He twisted away from the hook's path, grabbed Baptiste's wrist with both hands, and used the overseer's own momentum to send him stumbling forward into the muddy ground. Baptiste hit the earth with a wet thud, the iron hook flying from his grasp to land several yards away. For a moment, he lay stunned, unable to process what had just happened. An enslaved person had laid hands on him, had physically resisted his authority, had looked him in the eyes and shown no fear. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was revolution. "Help me!" Baptiste screamed, scrambling in the mud for his fallen weapon. "Guards, help me!" But the guards were at the far end of the plantation, dealing with what they thought was a minor disturbance near the livestock pens. And the workers in the western field, workers who had spent years watching Baptiste's cruelty, who had seen friends and family members scarred by his hook, who had learned to hate him with the quiet intensity of people who had no other outlet for their rage, simply stood and watched as their tormentor floundered helplessly in the mud. 5 minutes. Zabbath walked calmly to where Baptiste's hook had fallen and picked it up. The iron was warm from the sun, heavy in his hand, stained with the blood of countless victims. For a moment, he imagined using it as Baptiste had used it, driving it deep into soft flesh, watching eyes go wide with shock and pain. Instead, he hurled it as far as he could into the tall cane, where it disappeared with a rustle of leaves and would never be found. "You're a dead man," Baptiste gasped, finally managing to get to his feet. His face was purple with rage and disbelief. "Do you understand that? You're a dead man, and I'm going to make sure you die slowly." "Yes," Zabbath said simply. "I probably am." Then the church bell began to ring. It was not the usual call to prayer or mealtime. Those were single measured tolls that carried specific meaning within the plantation's routine. This was something else entirely. A rapid, urgent clanging that seemed to come from every direction at once. Baptiste spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, and that's when he saw the smoke rising from the direction of the sugar mill. 1 minute. All across San Cristobal Plantation, work stopped. Not the gradual slowdown of tired workers taking an unauthorized break, but the immediate, total cessation of all activity. In the eastern fields, machetes fell silent in mid-swing. In the domestic areas, cooking fires were abandoned and laundry left half-hung. In the livestock pens, gates swung open and cattle began wandering freely across the grounds. It happened simultaneously, precisely, with the coordination of a military operation, which, in its way, it was. Magistrate Herrera, riding his inspection tour near the main house, reined in his horse and stared in amazement at what he was witnessing. Everywhere he looked, enslaved people had simply stopped working and were standing motionless, their faces turned toward some invisible signal that he could neither see nor understand. Don Carlos emerged from the main house, shouting questions that no one answered. Guards ran frantically from one crisis to another, unable to process how many different problems had erupted simultaneously. Dogs barked. Cattle mooed. Smoke continued to rise from the sugar mill, and the church bell continued its urgent clamming. And in the middle of it all, Zabbath stood calmly in the western field, his hands empty, his face peaceful, watching as 8 years of careful planning reached its moment of perfect execution. Noon. The explosion was not large. Miguel was too skilled for that, and their goal was disruption rather than destruction. But it was loud enough to be heard across the entire plantation, and it sent a pillar of black smoke rising high into the clear sky like a signal fire visible for miles in every direction. The sugar mill's main grinding belt, cut with surgical precision and weakened over days of careful sabotage, finally snapped under the strain of its heavy load. Gears shrieked and ground to a halt. Steam escaped from ruptured pipes with whistling screams. The heart of San Cristobal Plantation simply stopped beating. At the same moment, the irrigation system that fed the eastern fields began spraying water in every direction as key valves were opened and critical pipes were severed. What had been carefully channeled rivers became chaotic fountains, turning the orderly agricultural landscape into a swamp. The livestock pens emptied as gates that had been secretly loosened over the past week finally gave way under the pressure of frightened animals. Cattle scattered across the plantation grounds, trampling carefully tended gardens and adding their panicked bellowing to the symphony of chaos. And throughout it all, the church bell continued to ring, its urgent voice carrying a message that every enslaved person on San Cristobal understood perfectly. This is what organization looks like. This is what we can accomplish when we work together. This is what freedom sounds like. Baptiste stared at the unfolding chaos with the expression of a man watching his world collapse around him. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else, what he was witnessing. This was not random destruction or spontaneous uprising. This was military precision applied to the cause of resistance. This was revolution. "How?" he whispered, turning back to face Zabbath. "How did you coordinate all of this?" Zabbath reached into his shirt and carefully withdrew his mother's recipe card. The yellowed paper seemed to glow in the noon sunlight, its faded writing as beautiful to him as any illuminated manuscript. "My mother taught me that every good meal starts with understanding your ingredients," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos erupting around them. "She taught me about timing, about patience, about knowing when each element is ready to be added to the pot." He held the card up so Baptiste could see it, though he knew the overseer could not read the Wolof script. "But most importantly," Zabbath continued, "she taught me that when the moment comes, when everything is prepared and the fire is exactly the right temperature, you must act with absolute commitment, If you hesitate, if you doubt, the moment passes and the meal is ruined. Baptiste's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and finally a kind of grudging respect that he clearly hated feeling. "You planned all of this," he said. "For weeks, maybe months. Years," Zabbath corrected gently. "Ever since they killed Domingo. Ever since I realized that individual resistance only gets individual people killed, while organized resistance plants seeds that grow into forests." The sound of horses approaching at a gallop interrupted their conversation. Magistrate Herrera had rounded up what guards he could find and was leading them directly toward the western field, his face grim with the understanding that he was dealing with something far more sophisticated than typical plantation unrest. "There!" Baptiste shouted, pointing at Zabbath with a trembling finger. "There's your ringleader. There's the one responsible for all of this." But as Herrera and his men drew closer, they could see that Zabbath was not attempting to flee or hide. He stood exactly where he had been throughout the confrontation with Baptiste, the recipe card still in his hands, his expression calm and almost serene. He was waiting for them. "Are you the one called Zabbath?" Herrera asked as he dismounted, his voice carrying the cold authority of Spanish colonial justice. "I am. Are you responsible for what has happened here today?" Zabbath looked around at the chaos still unfolding across the plantation. Smoke continued to rise from the sugar mill. Water continued to spray from the damaged irrigation system. Cattle continued to wander freely through areas where they had never been allowed to go. And everywhere, in every field and building and work area, enslaved people stood motionless and watched, their faces showing an expression that had not been seen on San Cristobal for as long as anyone could remember. Hope. "Yes," Zabbath said simply. "I am responsible." Herrera nodded, as if this confirmation was exactly what he had expected. "Then you will come with me now. There are questions that require answers." "Of course." Zabbath carefully folded his mother's recipe card and returned it to its place against his heart. "But first, I have something to give you." Before anyone could react, he reached into his other pocket and withdrew a second piece of paper, this one clean and white, with writing in perfect Spanish script. He handed it to Herrera with the same ceremoniousness he had shown the recipe card. The magistrate unfolded the paper and read its contents silently, his expression growing darker with each line. Finally, he looked up at Zabbath with something that might have been admiration. "This is a declaration of war," he said quietly. "No," Zabbath replied. "This is a declaration of humanity. We are not animals to be worked until we die. We are not property to be bought and sold. We are people, with names and histories and dreams and the God-given right to determine our own destinies." He paused, looking directly into Herrera's eyes with the same calm intensity he had shown Baptiste. "What you witnessed today was not destruction for its own sake. It was a demonstration, proof that we can organize, plan, and execute complex operations when we choose to do so. Proof that we are not the helpless victims you believe us to be." Herrera folded the declaration and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "And what do you hope to accomplish with this?" "Proof? That is not for me to decide," Zabbath said. "I have planted seeds. What grows from them will depend on soil and weather, and the choices made by people I will never meet." The guards moved forward then, their hands on their weapons, waiting for Herrera's command. But the magistrate held up a hand to stop them, his attention still focused entirely on Zabbath. "Do you understand what will happen to you now?" Herrera asked. "Yes." "Do you regret your actions?" Zabbath thought of Domingo hanging from the gallows with prayers on his lips. He thought of his mother standing over her cooking fire, teaching her son about patience and timing and the importance of adding each ingredient at exactly the right moment. He thought of Carmen and Miguel and all the others who had risked everything to plant seeds that might grow into something beautiful and terrible and free. "No," he said, "I do not regret anything." Herrera nodded slowly, then gestured to his men. "Take him." As the guards moved forward with chains and shackles, Zabbath offered no resistance. He allowed them to bind his hands, to loop the heavy iron around his ankles, to lead him toward whatever fate awaited him in the capital. But as they walked him past the groups of enslaved people who had participated in the morning's demonstration, he saw something in their faces that made every sacrifice worthwhile. They were no longer looking at the ground. They were looking at each other, and at him, and at the smoke still rising from the sugar mill, and their eyes were bright with the understanding that they had accomplished something that would be remembered and repeated and built upon. They had proven that resistance was possible. They had planted seeds that would grow into forests. The recipe was complete. The meal had been served. And for the first time in 8 years, Zabbath felt truly satisfied with what he had cooked. I'd love to know what city you're listening from right now, and how this story is landing with you. Are you at home, on a commute, taking a walk? Drop a comment and let me know. These stories connect us across time and distance in ways that feel almost magical to me. Act 4. The Spreading Fire. The dungeons beneath Havana's colonial fortress had been carved from living rock 2 centuries earlier, their walls black with moisture and the accumulated suffering of generations. Zabbath sat in the corner of his cell, his back against stone that stayed cold even in the Caribbean heat, and listened to the sounds that filtered down from the world above. Church bells marking the hours, the clip-clop of horses on cobblestone streets, the distant cries of merchants hawking their wares. It had been 3 days since they brought him here. 3 days since Magistrate Herrera had personally overseen his transport from San Cristobal plantation to the capital, the journey made in a prison wagon that allowed him to see the countryside rolling past through iron bars. He had used that journey to memorize everything he could: the locations of military garrisons, the condition of roads, the faces of people in the small towns they passed through. Not because he harbored any illusions about escape, but because information was a kind of wealth, and he had developed the habit of hoarding whatever riches came his way. Now, in the dampness of his cell, he carefully withdrew his mother's recipe card and unfolded it with the reverence of a priest handling sacred scripture. The paper had grown even more fragile during the journey, its edges soft as silk, the writing so faded that he could read it only because he had memorized every word years ago. Tiebudien, for the family feast. 2 handfuls of rice, washed until the water runs clear. The familiar words transported him, as they always did, away from stone walls and iron bars to a kitchen that existed now only in memory. He could smell the palm oil heating in his mother's clay pot, hear her humming as she prepared the vegetables, feel the warmth of the cooking fire against his face as evening settled over their village by the river. That kitchen seemed more real to him now than this dungeon. That life, the one where he had been Zabbath the fisherman's son, Zabbath who helped his mother cook for festivals and family gatherings, Zabbath who had been born free and had expected to die free, felt more true than anything that had happened to him since. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his reverie. Heavy boots on stone, accompanied by the jangle of keys and the low murmur of official conversation. Zabbath carefully refolded the recipe card and returned it to its hiding place, then composed his face into the careful neutrality he had perfected over 8 years of bondage. The cell door opened to admit Magistrate Herrera, followed by 2 guards and a man Zabbath had never seen before. Elderly, expensively dressed, with the soft features of someone who had never known physical labor. The newcomer carried himself with the automatic authority of Spanish nobility, and his eyes surveyed the dungeon with the detached interest of someone examining an interesting specimen. "This is him?" the elderly man asked, his Spanish bearing the refined accent of Madrid's royal court. "Yes, Don Francisco," Herrera replied, "the ringleader of the San Cristobal incident." Don Francisco, Zabbath committed the name to memory, stepped closer to the cell's iron bars, studying the prisoner with the intensity of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. "He doesn't look like much," Don Francisco said finally, I was expecting someone more imposing. Appearances can be deceiving, Herrera replied. This man organized and executed a coordinated operation involving dozens of conspirators, multiple simultaneous targets, and timing precise to the minute. The level of planning and discipline required was impressive. Don Francisco's eyebrows rose slightly. Impressive. Magistrate Herrera, I hope you're not developing sympathy for rebel slaves. Not sympathy, sir, respect for a capable enemy. This was not a spontaneous uprising born of desperation. This was military-level strategic thinking applied to the cause of insurrection. Zabbath remained silent during this exchange, but he catalogued every word, every inflection, every telling pause. These men were afraid, though they were trying hard not to show it. The demonstration at San Cristobal had accomplished exactly what he had hoped. It had forced the colonial authorities to confront the possibility that enslaved people were capable of far more organization and coordination than they had previously believed. What demands has he made? Don Francisco asked. None, Herrera replied. No requests for better treatment, no negotiations for the release of fellow conspirators, no attempts to bargain for his own life. He simply waits. For what? That, Herrera said, glancing at Zabbath with an expression that mixed frustration and grudging admiration, is an excellent question. Don Francisco approached the bars more closely, his soft features hardening with the particular cruelty of men who had built their fortunes on the suffering of others. You, he said, addressing Zabbath directly for the first time, you will tell us the names of your fellow conspirators. You will provide details of how your network was organized and how it communicates. You will reveal any other planned operations. Zabbath met the nobleman's gaze steadily. I will tell you nothing. Nothing? Don Francisco's voice carried genuine surprise, as if he had never encountered someone who simply refused to cooperate. Do you understand who I am? Do you comprehend the power I wield in this colony? You are a man who has grown rich from the labor of people you consider less human than your horses, Zabbath replied calmly. Your power comes from our acceptance of powerlessness. When that acceptance ends, your power ends with it. The silence that followed this statement stretched like a taut rope. Finally, Don Francisco turned to Herrera with an expression of barely controlled rage. I want him broken, he said quietly. Use whatever methods are necessary. The colonial government cannot appear weak in the face of slave rebellion. Other plantations are watching to see how we respond. Actually, Herrera said carefully, that raises an important strategic consideration. Information from our network of informants suggests that news of the San Cristobal demonstration has already spread to other plantations. There have been work slowdowns in Santiago, mysterious fires near Trinidad, reports of increased organization among slave populations across the island. Don Francisco's face went pale. Are you telling me this incident has inspired copycat rebellions? I'm telling you that our response to this situation will be closely observed by enslaved populations throughout Cuba. If we appear to be reacting from fear rather than strength, we risk encouraging further acts of resistance. Zabbath felt a warm glow of satisfaction spread through his chest. The seeds were already growing. Word of the demonstration was spreading exactly as he had hoped, carried by the invisible networks that connected plantation to plantation, carried by kitchen workers and field hands and domestic servants who moved between properties, carried by the natural human desire to share stories of hope. Then what do you recommend? Don Francisco asked. Herrera was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing strategic considerations. Public execution, he said finally, but not immediately. First, we interrogate him thoroughly, extract what information we can about the network and its methods. Then we execute him publicly, with maximum ceremony, ensuring that the message reaches every plantation on the island. And that message is? That the Spanish crown does not negotiate with rebels. That resistance leads inevitably to death. That no amount of organization or planning can ultimately prevail against imperial power. Zabbath continued to listen silently, but his mind was working furiously. They were making exactly the mistake he had hoped they would make, responding to coordinated resistance with individual punishment, failing to understand that martyrdom could be more powerful than success, missing the fundamental truth that seeds scattered by the wind of his death would grow in soil they could never control. "How long for the interrogation?" Don Francisco asked. "A week, perhaps 2. Enough time to ensure we've extracted everything of value, but not so long that other plantations begin to see delay as weakness." "Very well." Don Francisco cast one final glance at Zabbath, his expression mixing disgust with something that might have been fear. "But I want daily reports. If there are any additional incidents while he remains alive, you will bear personal responsibility." After the officials departed, leaving only the familiar dampness and the distant sounds of the city above, Zabbath allowed himself a small smile. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought in terms of individual leaders and followers, of extracting information and preventing future incidents. They couldn't comprehend that the real power of what had happened at San Cristobal lay not in its specific details, but in its demonstration of possibility. Every enslaved person who heard the story would understand the essential message. We can organize, we can plan, we can act. We are not helpless. That understanding could not be tortured out of him because it no longer belonged to him alone. It had spread beyond his control, beyond anyone's control, carried by whispered conversations and meaningful glances and the simple, revolutionary recognition that bondage was not natural, inevitable, or permanent. The interrogations began the next morning. They brought him to a room deep within the fortress, a windowless chamber lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The furnishings were sparse but ominous. A wooden table scarred with knife cuts, chairs positioned to create psychological pressure, instruments of torture arranged with the casual precision of a surgeon's tools. Herrera conducted the sessions personally, assisted by a thin man with pale eyes who introduced himself only as Vasquez. They worked methodically, professionally, beginning with simple questions designed to establish basic facts and gradually escalating toward more sensitive information. "How many people were directly involved in the San Cristobal operation?" Herrera asked on the first day, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "I acted alone," Zabbath replied. "That's impossible. The coordination required, the simultaneous timing across multiple locations, no single person could have managed all of that. Nevertheless, that is my answer." Vasquez leaned forward, his pale eyes glittering in the lamplight. "Perhaps you don't understand the seriousness of your situation. Cooperation might earn you a quick death instead of prolonged suffering." Zabbath said nothing. They tried different approaches over the following days. Herrera played the role of reasonable authority figure, suggesting that cooperation would benefit the very people Zabbath was trying to protect. Vasquez represented barely controlled brutality, hinting at tortures that would make death seem merciful. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes separately, always probing for weakness or contradiction. But Zabbath had spent 8 years learning to endure, and his endurance now served purposes beyond mere survival. Each day he remained silent was another day for the story of San Cristobal to spread, another day for other plantations to absorb the lesson that resistance was possible, another day for the seeds of rebellion to take root in soil across the island. On the 4th day, they brought physical persuasion into the interrogation. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Iron brands heated in braziers, knives that cut with surgical precision, techniques refined over centuries of colonial domination. But Zabbath had discovered something remarkable during his years of bondage. The body could be broken without breaking the spirit. Flesh could be torn without tearing the soul. He thought of his mother's hands as they worked, patient, careful, adding each ingredient at precisely the right moment, never rushing, never hesitating when the time came to act. He thought of Domingo dying with prayers on his lips, choosing dignity over desperation even as the rope tightened around his neck. He thought of Carmen and Miguel and all the others who had risked everything to plant seeds that would grow long after he was gone. The pain continued, but it could not touch the part of him that mattered most. "Interesting," Vasquez observed during a brief respite, dabbing sweat from his forehead with a cloth stained with other people's blood. "Most subjects begin talking by the third day. Some hold out for a week. But you—" He studied Zabbath with professional curiosity. "You're not even trying to negotiate. No offers of partial cooperation, no attempts to bargain for better treatment. It's as if you've already made peace with dying." "I made peace with dying 8 years ago," Zabbath said, his voice hoarse but steady. "The day they put me in chains. Everything since then has been borrowed time." Herrera, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward. "Then what has kept you alive? What made you fight instead of simply accepting your fate?" It was a more perceptive question than Zabbath had expected from his captors. He considered his answer carefully, aware that anything he said might provide insight they could use against his fellow resistors. Finally, he reached into his shirt. They had allowed him to keep his clothes, probably because the fabric would burn nicely during the eventual execution, and withdrew his mother's recipe card. The paper was more fragile than ever, its edges soft as flower petals, the writing barely visible in the lamplight. "This," he said simply. Herrera squinted at the faded script. "What is it?" "My mother's recipe for tiabudien, a fish dish from my homeland." Vasquez laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "A recipe? You've endured days of interrogation for a recipe?" "You wouldn't understand," Zabbath said, refolding the paper with infinite care. "You've never been hungry for home." But Herrera was studying him with renewed interest. "It's not about the recipe itself, is it? It's about what it represents. Connection to something larger than yourself. Proof that you existed before this, that you were someone before you became property." Zabbath said nothing, but Herrera's insight was uncomfortably accurate. "That's why you won't talk," the magistrate continued, working through his thoughts aloud. "Information about your network, names of conspirators, details of future plans, all of that is tactical. But this," he gestured toward the hidden recipe card, "this is strategic. This is about proving that enslaved people retain their humanity, despite everything we do to strip it away." "Does that change anything?" Zabbath asked quietly. Herrera considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't. You're still going to die, your conspirators are still going to be hunted down, and the colonial system is still going to grind on exactly as it always has." "Perhaps, Vasquez interjected. "There's no perhaps about it. You're one man. Your little demonstration affected one plantation. Do you really think you can change a system that spans continents and has endured for centuries?" Zabbath looked directly at his torturers, and for the first time in days, he smiled. "I think," he said calmly, "that you're more afraid than you're admitting. If what happened at San Cristobal was truly insignificant, you wouldn't be working so hard to understand it. If my death were truly meaningless, you wouldn't need to make it so public. If enslaved resistance were truly impossible, you wouldn't invest so much effort in preventing it." The silence that followed was different from the others, charged with recognition and mutual understanding. They all knew he was right. The demonstration at San Cristobal had accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish. It had forced the colonial authorities to reveal their fear. On the 7th day of interrogation, a messenger arrived at the fortress with urgent news from across the island. Herrera read the dispatch privately, then dismissed Vasquez and the guards, leaving himself alone with Zabbath for the first time since the interrogations began. "3 plantations," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from his prisoner. 3 separate plantations have experienced coordinated work stoppages in the past week. Same pattern as San Cristobal. Simultaneous actions across multiple work areas. Strategic sabotage of key infrastructure, no demands made, no negotiations attempted. Zabbath felt warmth spreading through his chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The plantation owners are demanding immediate military intervention, Herrera continued. The Captain General is considering martial law for the entire island. Spanish merchants are beginning to question whether Cuba remains a stable investment. Seeds, Zabbath said softly. What? Seeds scattered on the wind. Some fall on barren ground and die. Others find good soil and grow into trees that scatter their own seeds. Herrera leaned back in his chair, his expression mixing frustration with something that might have been respect. You knew this would happen. I hoped it would happen. I planned for it to happen. But hope and planning aren't the same thing as certainty. And now, Zabbath thought of Carmen and Miguel and all the others who had risked everything to plant those first seeds. He thought of enslaved people on plantations he had never seen, people whose names he would never know, finding the courage to organize and act because they had heard that such things were possible. He thought of his mother's patient hands adding ingredients to the pot at exactly the right moment, never rushing, never hesitating, trusting in the wisdom of perfect timing. Now, he said, we see what grows. That night, alone in his cell, Zabbath carefully unfolded his mother's recipe card one final time. The paper was so fragile now that he feared it might crumble at his touch, but it held together long enough for him to trace the familiar words with his fingertip. Tiboudienne for the family feast. 2 handfuls of rice, washed until the water runs clear. 1 large fish. She always preferred red snapper, but any firm fish will do. Tomorrow, Herrera would announce that the interrogations had concluded. The day after that, they would transport him to the Central Plaza for public execution. Spanish colonial justice would be served, and the Crown's authority would be reaffirmed through the ancient ritual of state-sanctioned murder. But tonight, in the darkness of his cell, Zabbath allowed himself to imagine kitchens across the island, where enslaved people gathered in secret, sharing stories of resistance and hope. He imagined conversations whispered in a dozen different languages, plans taking shape like his mother's recipes, patient, careful, each ingredient added at precisely the right moment. He had given them the most important ingredient of all, proof that rebellion was possible. Everything else would depend on their own courage, their own wisdom, their own perfect sense of timing. The recipe was complete. The meal had been served. And judging by the reports filtering back to Havana, people across Cuba were discovering that they had an appetite for freedom. Act 5. The authorities' fear. Dawn came early to Havana's Central Plaza, carried on the wings of seabirds that wheeled and cried above the colonial fortress where the Spanish flag snapped in the Caribbean breeze. By 6 in the morning, workers were already assembling the platform that would serve as the final stage for Zabbath's life, a wooden scaffold draped in black cloth, positioned to provide clear sight lines for the largest possible audience. Captain General Someruelos himself had ordered the execution to be conducted with maximum ceremony. Representatives from every major plantation on the island had been summoned to witness the Crown's justice. Military units had been deployed throughout the city to maintain order and project strength. Church officials had prepared prayers that would sanctify the proceedings and remind the assembled crowd that divine authority stood behind human law. But beneath the pageantry of colonial power, fear moved like a virus through the corridors of authority. Magistrate Herrera stood at his office window, watching the platform's construction through glass that needed cleaning. Behind him, his desk was buried under reports from plantation owners across Cuba, reports of work slowdowns, mysterious accidents, and what intelligence agents described as increased organizational activity among slave populations. The knock on his door came precisely at 7 o'clock, as he had known it would. Don Francisco entered without waiting for permission, his soft features drawn with the sleepless exhaustion of a man watching his world crack apart. "How bad is it?" the nobleman asked without preamble. Herrera turned from the window, gesturing toward the pile of reports. 6 plantations now, all following the same pattern as San Cristobal: coordinated actions, strategic sabotage, no demands or negotiations. The owners are beginning to panic. Can we link them directly to this Zabbath character? Does it matter? Herrera replied wearily. The connection isn't about direct communication or command structure. It's about inspiration. About proving that resistance is possible. Don Francisco slumped into the chair across from Herrera's desk, his expensive clothes wrinkled from sleepless nights. The merchants are getting nervous. 3 major investors have already pulled funding from new plantation developments. Sugar prices are starting to fluctuate as buyers question whether we can guarantee stable production. Herrera nodded grimly. The economic implications had been clear from the beginning. Cuba's entire colonial economy was built on the assumption that enslaved labor could be maintained through a combination of brutality and despair. When that assumption began to crack, everything built upon it became unstable. What does the Captain General want to do? Martial law, Don Francisco said. Military occupation of every plantation showing signs of unrest. Mass arrests of suspected organizers. Public executions conducted simultaneously across the island to demonstrate that resistance leads inevitably to death. And you think that will work? Don Francisco was quiet for a long moment, staring at the reports scattered across Herrera's desk. I think, he said finally, that we may have waited too long to recognize what we were dealing with. At that same moment, in a kitchen 3 miles away, a woman named Isabella was grinding corn for the morning meal and thinking about stories she had heard whispered in the market the day before. Stories about a plantation called San Cristobal, where the workers had stopped everything at once, where the sugar mill had fallen silent, where a man named Zabbath had looked directly into his overseer's eyes and shown no fear. Isabella was not enslaved. She was a free woman of color who earned her living cooking for wealthy Spanish families. But the distinction felt increasingly meaningless as reports of organized resistance spread across the island. Freedom, she was beginning to understand, was not simply a matter of legal status. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, and shared. She added water to the ground corn, working it with her hands until it reached the proper consistency for bread. The rhythm was soothing, familiar, connected to traditions that stretched back through generations of women who had fed their families despite poverty, oppression, and the constant threat of violence. But as she worked, Isabella found herself thinking about other kinds of recipes. Instructions for organization, coordination, and resistance that could be shared as easily as cooking techniques. She thought about the networks that already existed among domestic workers, the invisible connections that carried information from plantation to kitchen to market stall throughout the colonial economy. She thought about what might be possible if those networks were used for something more than gossip and survival. Meanwhile, in the fortress dungeon, Zabbath was receiving his final visitor. Father Miguel, no relation to his friend of the same name, was a thin man in his 50s whose brown robes marked him as a Franciscan missionary. The church had sent him to provide spiritual counsel to the condemned man, to offer the possibility of repentance and salvation even at this late hour. "My son," the priest began, settling onto the wooden stool that had been placed outside Zabbath's cell, "I have come to help you prepare your soul for the journey ahead." Zabbath regarded him with the careful neutrality he had perfected over 8 years of bondage. "And what preparation do you believe my soul requires, Father?" "Confession, first. Acknowledgement of the sins you have committed against God's ordained order. Then genuine repentance. And finally, acceptance of divine mercy through Christ's sacrifice." God's ordained order. Zabbath repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "Tell me, Father, when you look at the plantation system, when you see families torn apart and children sold away from their mothers, when you witness the daily brutality required to maintain what you call order, do you truly believe that reflects divine will?" Father Miguel shifted uncomfortably on his stool. "God's ways are mysterious, my son. Human suffering serves purposes beyond our understanding. Perhaps bondage is meant to bring souls to Christianity, to save the heathen from their ignorance. I was born Christian, Father. My family had been Christian for 3 generations before the slavers came. Then perhaps your suffering serves to test your faith, to purify your soul through trials. Zabbath leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. Or perhaps the men who profit from human bondage have convinced themselves and others that God approves of their greed. Perhaps they have corrupted your church the same way they corrupt everything else they touch. The priest's face flushed with indignation. You speak blasphemy. The church is Christ's bride, pure and incorruptible. The church is made of men, Father, and men can be bought, threatened, or simply convinced that their comfort depends on not seeing certain truths. Father Miguel rose from his stool, his brown robes rustling with agitation. I came here to offer you salvation, and you respond with accusations and heresy. Do you not fear for your immortal soul? I fear many things, Zabbath said quietly. I fear that the seeds we planted will not find good soil. I fear that the courage we tried to nurture will wither in the face of repression. I fear that the people I love will suffer because of choices I made. He paused, his fingers tracing the outline of his mother's recipe card through the fabric of his shirt. But I do not fear judgment by a God who created all human beings in his image, who gave them minds capable of recognizing injustice and hearts capable of choosing resistance over submission. If such a God exists, I believe he will understand why I chose to fight rather than accept bondage as his will. The priest stared at him for a long moment, clearly struggling with theological concepts that his training had not prepared him to address. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving Zabbath alone with his thoughts and the growing sound of activity in the plaza above. By mid-morning, the crowd had begun to gather. They came from throughout Havana and the surrounding countryside. Spanish colonists eager to see justice done, free people of color curious about this man who had dared to organize resistance, enslaved domestic workers whose masters had given them permission to attend as a lesson in the consequences of rebellion. But the composition of the crowd was not what the colonial authorities had expected. Instead of the unified display of Spanish solidarity they had hoped for, the gathering revealed the complex fault lines that ran through Cuban society. Enslaved people clustered together in groups that seemed unusually organized for casual assemblies. Free people of color watched the proceedings with expressions that mixed fear and something that might have been admiration. Even among the Spanish colonists, conversations seemed more heated than usual, as if the economic implications of plantation unrest were forcing uncomfortable questions about the stability of their world. Don Carlos, the owner of San Cristobal Plantation, stood near the platform with a group of fellow landowners, his face grim with the knowledge that his property had become the center of an island-wide crisis. The damage from Zabbath's demonstration had been repaired within days, but the psychological impact lingered like smoke from a fire that refused to die completely. Have there been any additional incidents on your property? Asked Don Esteban, who owned a sugar plantation near Santiago that had experienced its own work slow down the previous week. Nothing overt, Don Carlos replied. But the atmosphere has changed. The workers are different, more watchful, more careful about what they say and do in front of authority. Same on my plantation, Don Esteban said grimly. It's as if they're all waiting for something. Waiting for what? That's what worries me. I don't think they know either. But they're waiting. At 11 o'clock, the prison wagon arrived at the plaza, escorted by 24 soldiers in full military regalia. The crowd pressed forward to get their first glimpse of the man whose actions had sent ripples of fear through the colonial establishment. But what they saw surprised many of them.